walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. All around me a voice was sounding. This land
The focus
was
of our
made
program
for
today
you.
is so important that it not only concerns everyone watching, everyone on Long Island, really, that's just for starters, everyone everywhere. Subject is power, electrical power, nuclear power, and the kind of power that corporations and people crave who are power crazy. Power Crazy is a book written by Karl Grossman, who is our guest today, and we're going to find out a lot about the Long Island Lighting Company, about Shoreham, and a lot of wires that extend from there. So let's meet Karl Grossman. I'll tell you a little bit about him as soon as we do. Welcome, Karl Grossman.
Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Karl Grossman is an investigative reporter. He teaches journalism at New York State University in Old Westbury. He has written 3 books. Power Crazy is his latest book, but before this he's written Nicaragua, America's New Vietnam, The Poison Conspiracy, and What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power. He's also written for many of our magazines, national magazines, and he lives on eastern Long Island and has been investigating the nuclear situation since when? For how long?
Well, for years, more than a decade for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it's all in this book. And this book is so well documented, and it is so full of information that we all really need to know about, not should know about, not may want to know about, need to know about. This is an example. Look, I was going through the book. I have marked pages that I wanted to ask Karl about. Do you believe this? And there's so many here. It's like a year series, so we're going to try and do as much as possible right now. Karl, where should we start? Shall we start with Shoreham, this proposed nuclear power plant being the most expensive nuclear plant in the world, maybe? You want to do a little
Not
bit?
only the most expensive nuclear plant in the
Okay.
world, in fact, Shoreham is the most expensive power plant of any sort. I think you could probably use Jack Daniel's bourbon in a power plant and provide cheaper energy than what Lilco is going to provide with Shoreham. It's by far the most expensive power plant per proposed kilowatt ever constructed. You're talking about a plant which Lilco, in its first press release, I have it right here, talked about finally costing 65 to 75 million. My projection in the book is that we're talking about 6.5 to 7.5 billion with a B. The cost of electricity from Shoreham will be 5 times the cost of electricity now being provided by Lilco, which is in fact the second most costly electricity already in the United States because, well, Lilco, as I trace in the book, as I document in the book, has had a long history of mismanagement way before nuclear power. And it came upon Shoreham, and Shoreham was in fact just part of a series of nuclear plants that Lilco intended to build. In fact, that fantasy still is alive and well in the hearts of Lilco executives. It was Shoreham Nuclear Power Station 1. There's to be a Shoreham 2, a Shoreham 3, a Jamesport 1, 2, 3, and 4. But in any case, when Lilco, this traditionally mismanaged utility which in '48 was to be taken over by the Consolidated Edison Company because it was in such trouble, a utility which in the 30s and the early 40s was, as Ann Mead, a member of the State Public Service Commission, expresses in the book, was ready to go belly up, was ready to go bankrupt way back then. So here Lilco moved into this nuclear power phase of its history, and wholesale disaster in terms of economics.
Apparently, the mismanagement has included using inferior materials, cover-ups of all of that. There's so much to talk about. I want to get into some of the details, but just in passing, the links to organized crime were outlined in a television program on CBS on 60 Minutes. Can you just very briefly summarize that so we can get on to some of the other, what are their links to organized crime and some of the misspending of money?
Yeah, well, the 60 Minutes piece touched the surface. In fact, I assisted in the production of the 60 Minutes piece. Monica Jensen was the producer, and I worked with Monica. And they quite correctly pointed to, as my book points to, 5 principal unions on the Shoreham construction as being linked to, we're talking the mafia, we're talking about organized crime families, and in the book I mentioned the Gambino families and the Lucchese families, and we're talking about the laborers' union and
I'm more glad than ever that you're here. It's kind of amazing that you've gone through all this and still are here.
Well, and we're also talking about the security guards union, the union which is supposed to, well, keep things on the straight and narrow at Shoreham, in fact, is mafia connected. I mean, in every sense and in every way, the Shoreham project is just a picture of every possible form of corruption that can occur, I think, in this region.
This is not said lightly, let me tell you. Karl Grossman could not make statements like this. He could not say things like that unless he had documented the sources in this book, Power Crazy, and it is full of documentation, as I said before. But any statement that he makes, you may question, and if you get the book, you'll find the answers and where he found the material. But otherwise, I suggest anyway that you read it. But if you have any arguments with this, why not write to LTV, right? At 211 Fireplace Road in East Hampton, and we'll get those letters to Karl Grossman. Put attention, Karl Grossman. All right, we're going on with this. As I said, I'm going to use a couple of words with double meaning intentionally. This is a powerful book. It's got explosive material in it, and including how Lilko is wired to Washington. And here we go with that. It's very important, obviously. Our President Reagan has made a few appointments which point and are pertinent to what is happening on Long Island with Lilko. Dr. Nunzio Palladino, is that how we pronounce him, heads the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And would you tell just a little bit about his background?
Well, the most difficult and actually the most intriguing chapter for me to do in the book was the chapter about how Lilko was able to wire itself to Washington. And here is a local utility with one nuclear plant project, which the Reagan administration has made a litmus test of the nuclear future in the United States. In fact, the Energy Secretary of the U.S., a man by the name of Harrington, has proclaimed, not just once, numbers of times, that so goes Shoreham, so goes the nuclear industry. Shoreham must go into operation. If it does, it marks a new day for the nuclear industry, a new beginning. If it doesn't, we're in trouble. In fact, he tells this to members of the nuclear industry, we're in trouble. Why does Lilko have such a connection with Washington?
Right.
And I think, again, the theme of the book is how Lilko represents and how its Shoreham project represents the story of nuclear power in extremis. It's like somebody with 105 fever. You can really see the illness. And one of the illnesses that you can see in terms of Lilko and the Shoreham story is, well, it's really a nuclear teapot dome, which is happening in Washington, and in the Shoreham situation, you can see it so clearly.
That's what I realized in reading the book, and that's why I just want to very quickly just list these people's past positions. Dr. Nunzio Palladino was the head of...
Well, Nunzio Palladino has been a very critical figure in terms of Shoreham, and it shows, again, the enormous conflict of interest. Palladino was the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Prior to that, for 20 years, he worked for Westinghouse.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Which, with General Electric, is one of the major manufacturers of nuclear plants. And for 4 years, he worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And in the book, I show the collusion between the national nuclear laboratories, the nuclear industry, the utilities, and so on. So here is Palladino with these roots in the nuclear industry,
Right.
these roots in the national laboratory apparatus.
And he's director of the regulatory agency.
He's chairing the regulatory agency, and there's pages and pages in the book of documents which pass between Palladino and the NRC in general to expedite the Shoreham case, to move the Shoreham case involving to the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Management Agency. So you have a situation here where, well, it isn't just Palladino. When you look at the members of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you really have the nuclear foxes guarding the nuclear chicken coop, per se. I mean, they're not in any position to really be objective or to be proper regulators on this. Thomas Morgan Roberts, for example, he's another member of the NRC who has pushed Shoreham all he can through the years. He's still pushing Shoreham. Now, Roberts comes to the NRC from a top position. He was the chief executive officer of Southern Boiler Tank Works. They're in Memphis, Tennessee, and they make components for nuclear plants. Indeed, in the licensing last year of the Palo Verde nuclear plant in Arizona, and I go through this in the book, Roberts says, oh, the plant should be licensed. I know it's well made because my company provided components for the plant. I mean, the man has never known, apparently, what the words conflict of interest mean. The current chairman of the NRC, Palladino has moved on. The current chairman is a man by the name of Lando Zech, Z-E-C-H. And Zech formerly was a nuclear submarine commander. And since taking over for Palladino, he's made speech after speech saying every month for the next 15 years there should be a new nuclear or coal, you know which one he prefers, power plant licensed to operate in the United States. I mean, there's such a glut at this point of energy in this country.
Also, with with the other energy sources not really being, their money hasn't been going for research into wind and solar and other kinds of energy. Right?
Well, as long as you have people from the so-called Atomic Brotherhood, like Nunzio Palladino or Lando Zech or Thomas Morgan Roberts and so on, you're not going to have an emphasis on the safe, renewable, alternative energy forms. You're going to see a continued push, as the Reagan administration has been doing on nuclear technology.
Let's just go on to a couple of the other people that you have. Also, you've got the material documented in the book. Lynn Nofziger, who was the closest political advisor, right, to President Reagan at the beginning of his first term of office.
Well, Nofziger has been an operative, essentially, a close advisor for Reagan since he became the governor of the state of California. He was in the White House as the advisor on domestic affairs, then left. What Lilko did here was, in fact, hire Nofziger as...
That's what I want to get to. Where is Nofziger now, and how much is he earning from Lilko?
Well, so far he's been given over $500,000 by Lilko for being a connections man in Washington.
In the book, I think you had that he's being paid $20,000 a month by Lilko?
Yeah, that's what Public Service Commission records indicate. And he's been very important in making connections for Lilko in Washington.
And then just to show how far these wires in Washington extend and overlap, William Casey, who's the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, I understand from this book, was on the Lilko board of directors until he was appointed head of the CIA. You want to tell us a little more about that?
Well, Casey is a very pro-nuclear person here on Long Island. In fact, other than being a member of the board of Lilko, where he promoted nuclear power programs, not just Shoreham again, but this entire power-crazed scheme, so be it. Besides that, Casey had been the chairman of the Long Island Action Committee. This was a group that was set up in the 1970s, essentially on the behest of Newsday, the newspaper Newsday. And Casey was in charge of it. People from Lilko were mucky-mucks in this organization, and it followed a series in Newsday called Long Island at the Crossroads, which essentially proposed that the future of Long Island rested with a nuclear-powered, high-technology future. And Newsday, of course, any reader on Long Island of Newsday realizes that this newspaper is an avid supporter of Shoreham and a great booster of Lilko. So Casey was, again, not just a Lilko board member, but critically involved in this kind of elite organization, the Long Island Action Committee, The executive director, incidentally, was the son of the founder of the Long Island Lighting Company. Charles Pierce was on the board of the Long Island Action Committee. It was kind of where the nuclear gang on Long Island got together.
Is all that material
all
in here
the
too?
Book, yeah.
It's pretty explosive material. Next, this is a man who's not directly connected, but a statement that Donald Regan made. Donald Regan made a statement on Meet the Press. When was that? Last year, maybe, when if there were to be a nuclear leak accident from Shoreham, if it were to open, how would the people on Long Island get out? How could they get to safety? Do you know what Donald Regan suggested? I didn't see the program, but again, it's in this book. He suggested on Meet the Press that a bridge be built to Connecticut, and that's how everybody would get off the island. And it's inconceivable, but there it is. And then also...
well, with Regan, he knows Long Island because he had, in fact, been the chief executive officer of a major brokerage house which brokers Lilco stock. I mean, the conflict of interest on Lilco and Shoreham doesn't stop short
Merrill
anywhere.
Lynch,
I mean,
that is, right?
Yeah, Merrill Lynch. And he lived on Long Island when he was the Merrill Lynch head, so he knows the area. And he said flatly on television, you know that you can't evacuate Long Island, and he talked about it. But in terms of these names, I think really we should discuss the President of the United States,
Go ahead.
Ronald Reagan, because all these, whether it's Nunzio Palladino appointed by Ronald Reagan to office, or whether it's William Casey, or whether it's, I mean, this whole cast of characters doesn't act in pushing Shoreham without the President of the United States being quite involved. And I trace Reagan's background vis-a-vis nuclear power here because it's so critical to the Shoreham story.
Please,
it turns out that when the President, not then the President, but a Hollywood movie actor, was having trouble with his career.
Apparently having financial trouble, according to the book.
Yeah, I get into all the literature of that period of the 60s. What occurred was that the General Electric Company, which is the manufacturer of the reactor at Shoreham, gave Mr. Reagan, he was doing apparently stand-up comedy in Las Vegas at the time, gave him a job as their general goodwill ambassador. And in that capacity, for 8 years, he went around the country and he gave speeches just extolling the products of the General Electric Company, which, again, with Westinghouse, is one of the major manufacturers of nuclear power plants worldwide. In fact, 85% of nuclear power plants worldwide are of Westinghouse or GE design.
I remember the salary from the book. I think he started at something like $120,000 and then went to $165,000 in the beginning.
And they gave him
right?
perks. They gave him a full electric kitchen and so on. But he was.
But this is early on for an actor who wasn't working.
Well, he was GE's person, and more than just the host of the GE Theater. People kind of remember Reagan as the host of the GE Theater, but his relationship with GE was much more elaborate, much more comprehensive than that. And importantly, his functioning as a spokesman, well, I mean, he didn't work, once a week, make a speech. He writes about I got a copy of one of the General Electric newsletters, where Reagan is quoted as saying that he sometimes makes 14 speeches a day for General Electric, hopping around the country.
And I'm sorry, do you really think that all of this background applies now to the attitude of the most influential people in Washington towards the opening of Shoreham?
Oh yeah, this is a nuclear plant which I show also in the book, and this is I think the most important aspect here. I mean, the money aspect is very, very, very important. It affects our pocketbooks. The political corruption aspect is extremely important because it's really a comment of the nature of society today, the status of democracy today. But my biggest concern, as documented in the book, has to do with the safety of that facility. And it appears to be, against stiff competition, the worst, if not among the worst, if not the worst, constructed nuclear plant in the United States.
Now, that certainly wasn't intentional. That couldn't have been intentional. So what do you attribute that to?
Well, I don't know if it wasn't intentional in the sense that Lilko had to know, well, for example, when Lilko hired Stone and Webster to be the construction manager of the plant, apparently the only reason that it hired Stone and Webster, there were other competitive firms, but this is deduced by the State Public Service Commission investigation of the Shoreham project. The reason Stone and Webster was hired was because the marketing engineer of Stone and Webster was the son-in-law of the then president of Lilko. So it was a matter of nepotism. You know, when these kind of things are done, and you end up with Stone and Webster, well, I mean, I in fact use a Lilko report later on where it evaluates Stone and Webster's performance and finds it utterly outrageous.
Let me say here, this is a good place, that Lilko has the highest penalty on record for mismanagement. Would you explain that?
Yeah, well, that investigation, which pointed
that's
to
part of this, what you're saying.
Lilko's selection of Stone and Webster, was done by the New York State Public Service Commission, which hasn't done much of a job in terms of the public on Shoreham, but finally, because actually a staff attorney at the PSC, Joel Blau, very courageous person, began an investigation. He was given obstacles all along, but finally the information he began developing, which is too much for the PSC to try to cover up, so finally an investigation was conducted, a major one, on the malfeasance in terms of the construction, mismanagement, and so on.
How much was the fine?
The penalty was $1.395 billion, which is by far the highest penalty ever meted out by a regulatory agency for mismanagement. But in any case, when you talk about this kind of, well, what PSC describes
I have a question about that. I'm sorry, I don't.
When you talk about what the PSC describes as pervasive mismanagement, I don't think that kind of stuff was innocent. When you're talking about hiring of contractors and construction managers on the basis not of price or quality, but on the basis of nepotism and connections, I don't think these are innocent mistakes. And going back to Reagan, knowing, and he knows, because a lot of the information in this book come from government documents. I mean, he and his people know that this plant is terribly built. Again, when we got together last week, I pointed to government reports which talk about potential consequences if Shoreham would undergo an accident. And because it's in such a heavily populated area, I mean, here's the report I quote in the book. Shoreham, early fatalities 40,000, early injuries 75,000, cancer deaths 35,000, property damage 157 billion. So what you have is a terribly constructed plant right smack in the middle of the Northeast, where it could just affect. In fact, those figures are regarded by a nuclear engineer who helped me with this book, Dr. Richard Webb, as really an understatement. He feels that you're talking probably about 1 million dead if you have the ultimate accident at Shoreham. So faced with these kinds of issues, the President of the United States, I think, had to and has to be working out of his background here, trying to defend a project because, one, he comes from a background in General Electric where, I mean, this is GE's reactor, and two, his years of promoting nuclear power for GE have made him, like the Paladinos and like the Roberts and like the Caseys, as not at all objective on this issue. It's quite the scandal.
I just want to quote something from the book about the safety and the hazards that you mentioned, and this is last year in 1985. You wrote that in reply to a request from Representative Edward Markey, the NRC was asked, what does the Commission and the NRC, National Nuclear Regulatory Commission, believe the likelihood of a severe core melt in the next 20 years from those reactors now operating, those expected to operate during that time? The NRC's official response, now this is not about a plant that is badly built. This is supposedly assuming that the plants are well built. Official response, quote, in a population of 100 reactors operating over a period of 20 years, the crude cumulative probability of such an accident would be 45%.
And then they go in that report. In fact, here's the report that's taken from. They go on and say that they may be off by 5%. So what you're talking about is a 50-50 chance in the next 20 years of a severe core melt accident at a nuclear power plant in the United States. That's by government admission. And my conclusion in the book is that if there's going to be such an accident in the next 20 years, Shoreham is the prime candidate for, well, the kind of thing we saw occurring at Chernobyl, or far worse.
I want to read from something else in your book, just to make sure that it's on record, on television. Admiral Hyman Rickover was assigned by the government, right, to open the first nuclear plant in the United States about 30 years ago,
1957. It was opened.
And in 1982, when he made a farewell address before a committee in Congress, he had obviously changed his point of view, and we're going to hear that right now. He said, "I'll be philosophical. Until about 2 billion years ago, it was impossible to have any life on Earth. That is, there was so much radiation on Earth you couldn't have life, fish or anything. Gradually, about 2 billion years ago, the amount of radiation on this planet, and probably in the entire system, reduced and made it possible for some form of life to begin. Now, when we go back to using nuclear power, we are creating something which nature tried to destroy to make life possible. Every time you produce radiation, you produce something that has life, in some cases for billions of years, and I think there the human race is going to wreck itself. It's far more important that we get control of this horrible force, excuse me, and try to eliminate it. I do not believe that nuclear power is worth it if it creates radiation." And Karl Grossman just gave us the statistics on what is projected as far as accidents can go. There's a 50-50 chance. Do we want to mess around is the question, right?
Well, I do a whole chapter towards the end of the book. Do we need this nuclear plant?
Right.
I mean, sometimes you take a risk. If we want to fly to Los Angeles next week, or in fact, I have to take a little flight to, it's not very far away, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And you get on an airplane, you take a trip. Maybe I could drive to Wilkes-Barre, but I wouldn't be able to do my business and get back in time and so on. So you do take a calculated risk, but there's a need there. Now, is there a need for the electricity that Shoreham would produce? And I do an entire, well, I'd say 3/4 of the final chapter concerns whether we should take this risk, and it's quite the risk. And the answer is clearly, absolutely clearly no, that here on Long Island there are abundant sources of energy, which tied together with efficiency, energy efficiency, could suffice to provide all the energy we need. And it is, in my opinion, I actually go back to a report done in the 1970s, 75, by Fred Dubin Associates for Suffolk County, and Dubin has developed new towns and thousands and thousands of major living areas and so on, university communities and so on. And he stresses that here is Long Island on the same latitude as Madrid in Spain. This is a place that solar energy is just plentiful. I mean, anybody here on the East End is particularly aware, with all our sailing in our bays and so on, that the wind power potential of this area is just enormous. There's the whole area of photovoltaic cells. In fact, on my sailboat this summer, what I placed on it was a photovoltaic module.
What is that? Please explain for the audience and for me.
It's what provides the electricity on the satellites.
All right.
In fact, years and years ago, they tried nuclear power on satellites, but then a few of them came down crashing to Earth, and they stopped that, and they did a crash program to develop photovoltaics, and they convert sunlight directly to electricity.
Our deadline is crashing down upon us. We are about to go off the air in 1 minute. Before we do, would you please tell people where to write, and whether letters should come to you, or whether if they agree with you, letters should go somewhere else? Where should they write?
I think it's absolutely essential at this point to stand behind Governor Cuomo. Just last week, he gave the Long Island Lighting Company an ultimatum: abandon Shoreham. Phil Appleton from Sagaponack is calling Shoreham Chernobyl. I think that's the proper word.
And where do they write?
By January 15th, write to Mario Cuomo in Albany, stand behind him, and then write to Reagan and all the the Reaganites who are pushing, trying to ram this nuclear plant down our throats and say, we don't want it. We don't want it. We don't need it. We don't want to take this chance. Abandon Shoreham.
And with that, we're going to have to abandon you, at least for this week and for this program. And we're going to close with the theme song for this program, which is appropriately enough, This Land Is Your Land, with Woody Guthrie. It's his song, singing it. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you for being here. And thank you very much.
From the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. As I went a-walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. All around me a voice was sounding, this land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling in the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling.